which is, have you gotten into the conference game? Is that do you do cruises and have a live portion, that you get sponsored? Is that a fundraising scheme that you all use? And what do you think of it? Because I know everyone else does it.
We have been experimenting with events, but without the scheme part, ideally. We've really been looking at, there are things that audiences want to get together and discuss. There is a form of storytelling that really involves bringing people together in a room and having a conversation, and ideally a conversation that leaves you smarter and maybe inspired to do something. Those are the kinds of events that we are really looking forward to doing more of. We had, and I get chills every time I think about it, but we had an event in a church with the Reverend Barber that just blew the roof off. But no cruise because labor.
Yeah, we fact-checked the carbon thing on the cruise too, like 10 years ago, and our staff just wasn't going to go for it. So.
And no corporate, Reverend Barber wasn't sponsored by
Ben and Jerry's.
Oh,
they are the sponsors.
Yeah, and the California Foundation, right? There was
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. So no, we'll take it if it's ethical.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
Not all at once.
I'd love to ask a question about follow-up articles. One of the things that's haunted me throughout my career as a journalist, and particularly as an investigative journalist, is that in an almost virginally innocent way, we discover crime or horror or misdeed. And we expose it to the public, and then we turn our backs and go on to the next crime. And it seems to me that investigative reporting would benefit from a commitment to going back 2 years and 5 years and 10 years later to find out what happens. This is personally very painful to me because of the A.H. Robbins story, which we did on the Dalcon Shield, an IUD that turned out to be quite toxic for women. Well, A.H. Robbins was essentially driven out of business in the United States, went into bankruptcy because of the expose that we did at Mother Jones. But we found then 2 years later that all of these IUDs, 15 million of them that had been manufactured and were unsaleable in the United States, were being sold in the third world. And we were very slow to come to that story. And I realized that there needs to be a kind of commitment to follow through that I think is worth a conversation among editors. That it's not directed against you in any way, just as a large question as to how to do investigative reporting with more depth.
I mean, that is, and I won't say that we at all do a perfect job of it, but that precise reason is why we went to our board and in the Mother Jones 2.0 initiative, and said we can't do investigative reporting in the model that we had at the time, which was mostly freelance investigative reporters and editors at Mother Jones. We need to be able to follow, we need to go down rabbit holes we know might not be productive, and we need to be able to follow up. And so we need a staff written, a more newspaper-like staff structure. And I think that has paid off enormously for just that reason, being able to follow up. I think another thing that we've been able to do is to sort of dedicate reporters to a beat that might be a little bit more unusual. So, for example, Julia Lurie, who just became a Livingston finalist today, has had a beat. After the 2016 election, I was looking at a map of where Trump won and didn't win, and had just looked at a map of the worst parts of the opioid crisis, and I was like, there's something here, like let's, not that the whole story has to be about exactly that intersection, but let's report on the opioid crisis, but not just from a science and medicine desk point of view. We'll do a lot on that, but we're really gonna get into who's making money on it and how this is affecting the political landscape. And so, having staff writers and being able to kind of dedicate someone for a few years to, in some ways, a sort of esoteric imagination of a beat has been really great. I think that's when we've done our best work, frankly.
I didn't know that so you have shifted, you've gone against the industry. The rest of the industry is relying more on freelancers because they're just trying to cut costs. And you've gone the opposite way. So that was because you wanted to have, I mean, in many ways, the freelancer model is flawed, right? Because it rewards the wrong sorts of things. So was it just for that reason that you went in that direction, or was there something else that you tried to push?
Well, we knew we wanted to be more than a bi-monthly magazine. We had a limited web presence at the time, but we knew we wanted to cover things 24/7. And I think for the reasons that Richard alluded, that we really wanted to be able to follow up on things and not just have this be one writer who might be a great freelance writer. We still do freelance journalism, and it's wonderful to have that, person come in with a passion and expertise on something that we might not have on staff. But the bulk of what we do is now staff written.
It was basically that investigative reporting is a mission and a preoccupation and not a story.
Right.
And so we had to build that preoccupation.
All the way in the back, Benny.
Hi, I'm Benny Becker. I'm a current fellow and a public radio reporter from Eastern Kentucky. I have a question along the same lines. I've looked before at your job postings page, and I was struck not many other places list their jobs as 37.5 hours and emphasize work-life balance quite as prominently. So I feel like this is connected to what you've been talking about, but I'm curious, I mean, with the state of the journalism industry, I feel like a lot of people feel like they're not in a position to argue for a better work-life balance or to have strong feelings about their employment dynamics. So I'm curious, like, what led you all to emphasize that, and how you feel like that affects the body of work that you've created?
Well, for one thing, we're a union shop, and we have been, if not all the way back to the very, very beginning, pretty close after that. So those values and concerns have always helped guide us. And certainly, it's been an area of concern in our reportage as well. But, also, along with many other folks at Mother Jones, Monica and I are working parents. When we first took over the job, Monica soon thereafter had her third child, and then soon after that, I had my first child. There's a misbegotten photo of me. I don't know what I was thinking, but after delivery, looking at galley pages. I mean, shoot me now. I would kill anyone on my staff who did that now, but it was a new job. So, I mean, but even for that, craziness on my part and Monica's part, we feel it's really important. And we also, just as managers and employers, it's a better company and business for supporting our staff. They do work 37.5 hours a week. It's not every single week, sometimes it's crazy, just like any journalism place. And then we try and, let people kind of make that up. But that's important to, have people recharge and just sort of, and stay with us for longer as a result. So there's that benefit to us as well.
Matt?
I had a question for Kathleen Flynn. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Matt Teague. I'm one of the current fellows. And I'm sorry for shouting at you, even though you're 2 seats away from me. I was taken with the idea that you guys created this documentary to go along with Unprotected, so that the people who are actually victimized could follow the story and keep up. And I was just curious how that was received and what happened with that.
Well, interestingly, so originally, actually, we went into it, was a very sensitive story, and I'm a photojournalist, and not a lot. I actually couldn't film most of what we reported on because it was so sensitive. But I did the interviews that I could, but I recorded a lot of the interviews, and I made as many pictures as I could. But because it was so sensitive, and because the story was so much about the exploitation visually of these girls, we actually came back and pitched it as a podcast. But luckily this was a team effort, and we had a group of people with a lot of different ideas on how we could, actually make this a video and a documentary. And I think and then I think we did think about the audience and like how it would impact people in Liberia. And so, yeah, I mean, it was probably one of the best collaborations in that regard, and that we had like a huge number of people kind of giving input on how to do it. Am I answering your question? I can't remember.
I was just curious how it was received.
It was received, so as soon as it ran, it basically, within the week, there were protests on the street.
Wow.
And, you know, there was, if you look online, we've got like, I think there were like thousands of people, and they were like approaching, you know, all the ministries. But it's taken them, you know, 6 months to say anything, and the ministries have still not you know, revealed the findings of the 7 different investigations that have been done. So, good job.
All right, thank you. Right back here, and then Jonathan.
Well, I'm not an award winner, so I don't know if I should ask a question, but as James mentioned, I'm Tim Leland, and James mentioned that I worked with Bill Taylor for many years as assistant to the publisher. And before that, I was the managing editor, and before that, I was a reporter, which takes us back all the way to 1969, ancient history to most of you people. But on that year, I went to our editor with an idea. Really had never been tried in the United States, as far as I know. The idea was that we start a full-time, multi-member investigative team, investigative unit that would work outside of the city room, have its own budget, report to an editor, special editor, not the city editor, and we would call it the Spotlight Team, which I was able to sell to the editor, Tom Winship, but not without a certain amount of trouble, actually, because at the time, it seemed like a very expensive possibility, you know, it was going to take a lot of time of the staff, and there was a certain idea that maybe it was going to create some morale problems. In fact, Tom, who was a very good friend of Ben Bradley's, sent me down to talk to Ben. He said, "Get down and try that out on Ben, see what he thinks of it." So I went down there. I knew Ben slightly, kind of young at the time, pretty intimidated by Ben Bradley. But I walked in and gave him my pitch, and I thought for sure that Ben Bradley would like this idea. But he looked at me when I got through my little spiel, and he said, "Tim, that is a terrible idea. Go back to Tom and tell him not to do that. It'll create morale problems. It'll cost a lot of money. You'll spend a lot of time spinning your wheels, and it won't be a success." So I tell all this not to beat my own horn here, but my question is, that was 50 years ago, and the Spotlight Team, I think everybody would have to say, has been fairly successful. We actually won a Pulitzer Prize the very first year we started it. And I was running at that time, not for much longer after that. But the question is, how many people here work for a paper or a magazine or any other publication that has a full-time, multi-member unit that is devoted solely to investigative journalism? I'd be curious if we could. Well, that actually is more hands than I would have expected. I'm delighted to see it, because investigative journalism, you know, is a certain path to the future of our profession here. It just seems to me that there should be more of these units. We do a lot of investigative reporting. I applaud all of you here that's being awarded for all the work you do. But I would encourage any of you who work for a paper that doesn't have a unit of this sort to go back to your editors, your publishers, and propose it. And of course, the first thing he's going to say is, "No way, costs too much money. Can't be done. We don't have the staff for it. We don't have the time for it. We don't have the money for it." And it may create some morale problems. But give it a go, give it a try, and the Spotlight Team. That was, as I said, that was going on 50 years ago. It's still going strong. It's done amazing things for the Globe's image, its position in the community here. People wait to see what the next Spotlight investigation is going to be. Very important to have a logo for an incident. Don't just say we've got a team. Give it a name. Don't call it the Spotlight team. Something else.
Did you go back and tell Winship Bradley thought it was a great idea?
I went back, I know, that's a good question. I went back and I sort of, went into his room feeling pretty, uncomfortable. I had spent a year, I have to tell you that this idea was not my idea. This idea was something that I stole from the London Sunday Times. Tom had sent me off for a year's sabbatical to work first in South Africa on a number of papers there, and then to go up to London to see what was going on at the London Sunday Times. Everybody said it was the best paper, maybe the best English-speaking paper in the world. And so I went up there and I learned quite a few things about what they do. But the main thing I studied and I was so impressed about it was something they called Insight, the Insight team, still going on. Well, I don't know actually whether it is still going on, but at the time it was just tremendously successful. We had 5 or 6 reporters working full-time, and they'd uncovered like the Christine Keela scandal. I don't know if that's probably, Philby was a Russian spy and the government, they'd uncovered that. I don't know, a lot of other wonderful investigations. So, that was the prototype. That's what I tried to sell to Tom. And I did come back. Here I am thinking I've spent a whole year abroad. I've come back with one main idea. I'm going to go in and try and sell it to Tom Winship. And I got to tell him that Ben Bradley, his dear friend, thinks it's a terrible idea. This was all before Watergate, I have to say. Ben had he'd had a bad experience with a couple of, individual reporters that he'd sent out, not really as a team. They'd gone around Washington and they were sort of big feet investigative reporters, and they had sort of second-guessed each other a little bit. And in the end, it didn't work out well. They ended it. And that was just about when I arrived in Washington. Ben told me, don't do it. But that's much longer story than I should have told. But I do want to encourage you. See if you can get more of these full-time teams going in your publications. Your publisher will be very happy, I think, if you start to produce the kinds of journalism that a full-time team can do, not just a one-person, one-shot. Every so often, we'll see if we hear something, let's go see what it is, and send a Joe reporter out to look at it. But a team that's there, working all the time on investigative stories and coming up usually with something pretty good.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a current Nieman Fellow. I'm curious, the sort of disbanding of the markup happened fairly publicly. And one of the things that came out of that, at least on my Twitter feed, was this conversation between one of the feelings that the shifting of the paper was going to be around, the outlet was going to be more anti-tech focused as opposed to reporting on. So there's this weird sort of theory around, like, is this an advocacy focus or versus one that is actually doing deep reporting? And I'm curious, I appreciate the directness of your headlines and how you actually clearly state what the story is. And so do you have feelings on how publications can avoid that tension? Because sometimes I think it's a perception issue as opposed to an ethical one. I think the ethics are solid, but the way people receive the kind of reporting that they're not necessarily used to, that it challenges, but they dig into, as you mentioned, people might disagree, but they respect it. You've done that very well. I'm curious if there are methodologies or ways that you've sort of tested that and made that sort of a stalwart of what you do.
I think the one thing we know about the markup now is that the tension was so much more than, about so many other things than that. But it is a challenge that a lot of news organizations deal with, including many that, never really thought they would have to deal with it, that never really thought they would have to defend going after, lying and corruption because it happens to be associated with, a president from a particular party. It's been part of the core set of values of Mother Jones from the get-go to be transparent about the fact that every story comes from a place. Everybody brings their values, their experience, their cultural blind spots, their passions, and that you can have all that but follow really rigorous journalistic methods and arrive at a place where you can fairly and appropriately represent people who are very, very different and who think very, very differently.
I mean, on the more narrow question of tech advocacy, I agree. I think that the whole markup situation is fluid and everyone's got an axe to grind, and I don't know enough to take a side on any of it, but I will say that as someone who had like a 4-month Twitter string saying Facebook is a garbage company, that like when Facebook is a garbage company, when there's been every manner of way that they've degraded our privacy, that they've engaged in duplicity on the political front, that they've treated their workers badly, like just on and on and on. You can call that advocacy, or you can just call that an accurate, headline or sentiment in a tweet. I don't think that, a refrain, what was the refrain of mistruth? The refrain of a disingenuous refrain? Inaccurate refrain. I mean, I think that, if we're gonna get into Trump's intent every time he lies, that's fine maybe if it's a new lie. But if it's a lie he's told for 2.5 years, that he's been called out in every forum and in every manner possible, and he still continues to do it, I think his intent is clear. And I think that journalists shouldn't be afraid of saying what that is. We can speculate as to the impetus or the mental stability that may or may not be behind such statements, but I think that we know that he's knowingly telling a mistruth, having been told by his own staff, by members of Congress, by the journalism community at large, that it is not accurate. So that's sort of a little bit of a distance from your question, but I think that journalists, like now more than ever, have to just be afraid to, not be afraid to just call it as you see it. And that the sort of view from nowhere, like vaguely ambiguous headlines, don't really serve your audience.
James?
I actually just wanted to follow up on that and ask the other winners and finalists to respond to that point. How do you, what kind of language do you use, especially for recipients of an award for fairness? How do you treat your subjects fairly when they're clearly doing something wrong that is also technically illegal?
Not everybody at once.
I'll take that. So we had lots of discussions about whether.
Do you mind standing up?
Yep, Robert Friedman. We had lots of discussions.
Can I ask a question, which is that you just go up there and address us all? I think the guy doing the camera would probably really appreciate it.
I think that Zeke hit on this in his remarks when he talked about fairness. And fairness is not having necessarily a balanced point of view, but it's being passionate about a subject. We had a big debate about whether to call these people predatory lenders. Some of our standards editors said, well, you can't use the word predatory, that's judgmental. And Zach and Zeke, to their credit, kept saying, but they are predatory. And we looked up the definition of predatory, and we had long discussions about this. And in fact, what these lenders do is charge usurious rates that are unregulated because they're not technically loans, they're cash advances, and there's no regulation for that. So although there are loan sharking laws about how much interest rates banks can charge, there are no regulations. This is an unregulated industry. They can charge 400% interest rate a year. There is to me, this is predatory. This is, and so we use that word quite boldly in our headlines. This was a little strange territory for Bloomberg, which prides itself on not being too judgmental. But I think it was a good lesson in how far you can take your convictions in your reporting. And the series that we did, that these guys did, began with these outrage about the stories that they heard from the borrowers that got their bank accounts raided and stolen, who went bankrupt as a result of it, who in one case a guy tried to kill himself. And it was that outrage that sort of drove the journalism here. And I think that's a healthy thing. I don't think, as you're saying, you need to be afraid of that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I missed you before.
Hi, I'm Myra McPherson, and I wrote biography, and I also wrote Watergate profiles when I was at the Post about criminals before they were charged. My question is about, it's one of the great lines of Izzy's when he said, if the president lies, must the press fib? And we have this situation today with tweets that drive you absolutely up the wall because they're almost always filled with some form of lie or a distortion of the news. And people keep repeating it on television, in articles, and I'm just wondering, how do you approach that? We never had that problem, so I'd like to know.
Who's gonna take?
There's where to begin. Daniel Dale, who is a journalist who has been making a point of counting the president's lies from the beginning, had a Twitter thread the other day that I think really spelled out quite well how everybody knows that the lies are happening. Everybody knows that they are at a record level. We can, nitpick about the semantics, but should we be making that part of the lead in the piece? Because it's no more and no less news than, the president attacked Democrats in this speech. We also know that that's going to happen. So why not start out by saying, repeating 15 falsehoods in the space of 5 minutes? The president said this. It's very difficult for journalism to, I think, get away from the other factor here is the sort of constant referee working that has been happening. That, when you yell at the press long enough and hard enough about the truth being an exercise in bias, people start to overcorrect for it and start to bend over backwards to, appease the people who are often in bad faith doing the yelling. There are people who have criticisms of the press in good faith, and we need to engage with that and listen to it and be made uncomfortable by it. But there are also people who are really just pursuing an agenda of making us less bold in pursuit of the truth. And we don't have that much time to get this right.
And I think one of the ways that's played out to its worst end is how the platforms have been worked. I mean, they've been lectured at and tried to accommodate a sort of particular strand of conservatism by folks going up and yelling at Facebook or making up this whole shadow banning conspiracy about. Like the president was saying the other day, well, somehow my Twitter following has diminished slightly. It's like, welcome to the club, buddy. But yet they have them so running scared that article, I can't remember who did it the other day, but talking about, which is quite remarkable, internal folks at Facebook and at Twitter, sort of two different stories talking about how, yes, this is going on, and they could, the story where they could kind of screen out super white supremacist stuff on their platform, but they're not doing it because they're worried that they're going to catch up, Steve King or whomever else tweeting or retweeting white supremacists, and then conservatives will yell at them. I mean, the fact is that they have the tools to kind of block much of what ISIS does in terms of hate speech and disinformation and recruiting. They could do the same for white supremacists, but they're not. And that's basically because the refs have been worked. And also probably some revenue involved. But the same is true when journalists get yelled at again and again. I think that this is, I think we saw this in tech reporting. From the get-go, there was a lot of cheerleading because there's a lot of exciting new stuff happening, but also because the tech companies are so loath and so unused to getting any kind of negative press that they would just flip out. And journalists responded to that by wanting to keep their sources, and it's a really unvirtuous cycle going on there. Thankfully, I think that's been mitigated lately, but it's something that we all have to pay attention to.
Yeah. Okay. And any final thoughts from anyone? We're about ready to wrap it up. Well, Yoshi?
Hi, my name is Yoshi. I'm a current Nieman Fellow and a Bloomberg News reporter based in Tokyo. So I'm just curious to ask your thoughts on this. So the next presidential election is coming up, and I think from what I observed based in Tokyo, watching from outside, I think that the journalism probably learned some lessons from covering the previous presidential election, and I was wondering what are your thoughts on what went well last time, or what do you try? How do you try to cover differently next presidential election in the U.S.?
Well, I think we just, so the question is essentially, have we learned enough from what happened in 2016 in terms of better covering a changed political landscape? And I think, some of this we were just talking about really as part of the discussion that Myra kicked off. I think it would be a huge stretch to say that we've learned the lessons as a profession. And all of us made mistakes. All of us missed part of the story. And some improvements have been made, but there also is a degree of defensiveness and allegiance to what we're used to and the way that we have historically done things that is particularly powerful in the context of a presidential campaign, where muscle memory or something kicks in, and it's very, very difficult for any of us to confront just how flawed the traditions and habits of the profession are.
Yeah, I think that that's true. There were a lot of mistakes made and stories not told or not amplified well enough. But I think one of the greatest problems we have throughout the industry, but I think particularly amongst the biggest, heaviest hitters, is that there's not a willingness to kind of own up to what happened and really report out what happened. The story that continues to obsess me is on the same day that David Corner, our Washington bureau chief, was the first one to report on the Steele dossier. And before the election, before any of that, the Times had a story that the headline of which was, FBI says there's no Russian interference in U.S. election or something to that effect, which certainly helped bury our story. But also like that story, I just still go back to even the timing of the two. Like we had queries out for a few days to the Trump campaign and the major players therein. I just want to know what led them to that. I mean, I think eventually we'll learn, but I think if journalism was more honest about when it screws up and why, in closer than, historian 20 years from now, our democracy would be better off. Because it's true, we make mistakes, big and small. Like we're all on deadline. We all have sources that we're trying to nurture. There are traps of biases and other pitfalls that we all fall into. But I think the unwillingness to examine and to be public about the mistakes that we make does not serve our industry well. It leads to a lot of the mistrust that people have about us. I think this is particularly true for the biggest institutions. I mean, those memories are long amongst the public. But I think if we could do one thing, it would be like bring back the ombudsman, do more of this, do more media reporting that was about that and really probative and thoughtful and not just got you or who got fired. That is one thing I would like to see our profession invest more time and money in.
All right, good, thank you. Let's congratulate all the winners and finalists today. Thank you.